Thank you so much. Can you see my slides? Yes. If I show them like that? Great, I'll start then. As Christina said, and you can hear me well, right? If I speak like this, you can hear me no problem, right?
Yes, perfect.
Good. Like Christina said, most of my work has been on morphology and especially on second language morphological processing. I've started giving this talk or a similar talk about maybe 2 years ago. We essentially put together a series of results that we have amassed in the last couple of years, and we have been trying to interpret these results and tell a story about this. And in particular, we think that the results that we've been obtaining with second language morphological processing, that they are quite insightful in terms of the organization of the morphological system, but the organization of the human language system in general. In particular, it seems that we obtain different results, let's say it that way, for different parts of the morphological system, and that suggests some sort of internal differentiation in these components. But like I said, I've been giving this talk a few times, and maybe you've seen me already talk about these things. I'm actually reaching that point in which this particular set of results are already becoming a little bit boring, let's say. And so I'm starting to become more excited in the parts that I'll show you at the end, and that's the outstanding questions that we haven't really resolved yet, and also particularly excited about the topic of variability and differences between speakers, individual differences, but also variability within speakers. That is, why is it that from trial to trial people can be more inconsistent, let's say, or more consistent in their responses? And so I'll try to focus more on these final parts of the talk. Do stop me if you have any questions, even in the middle, and then I'll just give more time to certain things. But I hope that we still have some time for discussion at the end of the talk to focus on these topics that are more current, let's say, and more outstanding. Let me just give you a little bit of an introduction about the kind of work that I do. A lot of it starts from this notion that there are some very striking differences between learning a first language from birth and learning a second language, usually later in life. And of course, this is all very well characterized, and people talk about ultimate attainment being more difficult, being somehow compromised, or the learning process being more difficult when it's done later in life, at least for certain parts of the linguistic system. And another striking difference that has been recognized is that L2 representation, acquisition, processing is characterized by greater variability or individual variation in the end state of grammatical knowledge. And finally, there is also a substantial influence of external factors on non-native acquisition. Things like exposure and learning and teaching styles and different amounts of practice, motivation, psychological factors, social settings, etc., etc. And so there are these clusters of differences between native and non-native acquisition. And the question then becomes, how can we account for these? And also, what parts of the language system are particularly different between L1 and L2 acquisition? I'll be using L1 and L2 in general. A lot of times what I mean is really native versus non-native acquisition, because I'll show you some results that have to do with age of acquisition. But at least as a proxy, I often use L1 versus L2. If we go back to the seminal study on L2 acquisition by Johnson and Newport in 1989, they have reported these well-known age of acquisition effects on morphosyntactic judgments, grammaticality judgments of sentences that could have violations of morphological and morphosyntactic aspects. And they showed this pronounced effect of age of acquisition more or less throughout the lifespan, also with increased variability here for the late learner group. And starting from that original finding, the question of interest has been, how can we explain this? Broadly speaking, we could say that there are two very broad types of answers. I'm going to simplify a bit and make this a little bit more extreme than maybe it needs to be. But because I want to focus not on specific accounts and specific models, but on the general characteristics of these broad perspectives. In one of these perspectives, it is said that essentially representation, learning, and processing of language in a second language is similar, or it involves similar mechanisms in L1 and L2. And so whatever differences we find between second language processing and first language processing, they can be explained by appealing to essentially exposure and practice, to the influence of L1 or bilingualism, to different kinds of psychological and socioeconomic factors. Oftentimes another explanation that is put forward has to do with the speed of processing. So processing in an L2 is said to be slower and more resource demanding compared to processing one's native language. So under these kinds of accounts, what we have is essentially a quantitative difference, a gradient difference between L1 and L2. The differences between an L1 and an L2 speaker are not exactly sharp or categorical, but they take a more gradient format. And oftentimes these are said to be general differences. So they are expected to essentially, they may vary with difficulty, but essentially they are expected to apply to the language system more or less as a whole. On a very different type of account, this goes back to Blave Roman in 1990, as I'm sure many of you know, it is said that there are fundamental differences between L1 and L2 acquisition, representation, processing. And so the idea is that a late learner has only partial access to the mechanisms of language acquisition. And so age of acquisition is not the only factor, but it becomes an important determinant of what can be acquired and how, what representation it takes, and then how it can be used in processing. Importantly, these kinds of accounts that have to do more with this kind of rationalist, nativist perspectives of language acquisition. On this kind of account, it is said that there are selective differences between L1 and L2 processing. That is, certain specific parts of the language system appear to be more affected, let's say. They are good candidates for differences between L1 and L2. Other components of the language system actually show no differences and can essentially be acquired in the same way throughout one's life, so even as a late learner. So what domains of language are those that we think may be particularly different between L1 and L2 speakers? Well, going back to that original study by Elisa Newport and Jacqueline Johnson, their grammaticality judgment task essentially consisted of sentences that fit into these different rule types, or that allowed us to assess these different rule types. As you can see, all of these are essentially in the domain of morphology, syntax, word order, and aspects of morphosyntax. And indeed, when we try to characterize these differences between L1 and L2 in this kind of broad categories, it would seem, and I am aware that this is a very simplistic way of putting it, but if we wanted to make some sort of dichotomy, it would seem that aspects closer to the syntactic parts of language and the more abstract, formal, grammatical aspects of language would seem to cause more difficulties to L2 learning, or possibly to invoke different mechanisms in L2 learners compared to aspects to do with lexicon and semantics. It has been argued, for example, that complex and abstract aspects of syntactic structure, in particular hierarchical syntactic structure, abstract, very implicit constraints, are more difficult to acquire in an L2. Some people like Michael Ullman, Harold Klassen, they've proposed that morphological combination is particularly difficult or less efficient in second language speakers compared to, for example, vocabulary, lexical storage, etc. So if we wanted to put this into some sort of broad umbrella, we might say that the grammatical formal aspects of language are good candidates for L1, L2 differences, as opposed to for example, aspects to do more with content and meaning, discourse aspects, semantics, etc. This, of course, is a very broad characterization, but this is the characterization that we started from. We wanted to have some inspiration for our work, and essentially we grabbed this. Elisa Newport, for example, has a paper where she makes this distinction between formal and content aspects of language. Michael Ullman has made this distinction between declarative memory and procedural memory. Harold Klassen, and of course, going back to Chomsky, we have this distinction between lexicon and grammar, or the storage and the computation aspects of language that is very common and traditional in generative linguistics. And so starting from that as some sort of inspiration, we wanted to use morphology as a test case for these very broad perspectives. And one thing that is interesting about morphology is that essentially it contains aspects of storage and of computation, aspects that are lexicalized and aspects that have to do with combination and hierarchical structure. And so morphology is this kind of intermediate domain, let's say, that allows us within this single part of the language system to contrast lexicon and grammar, if I'm simplifying this. And in particular, we used the contrast between inflection and derivation in the world's languages to attempt to test these broad perspectives. So as you know, inflection is essentially the type of morphological combination in which grammatical morphemes are attached to stems. It is often determined by the syntactic contents. For example, we have things like agreement, of course, subject-verb agreement, etc. Different kinds of agreement that determine inflection. It's as a process, morphological inflection tends to be very productive, very transparent in its semantics, and it's obligatory in some fundamental sense. That is, for a given verb, for example, we have a paradigm of cells that all need to be filled, except in some cases of defective verbs, but in general, all these cells of the paradigm need to be filled by the application of these morphological rules. Also importantly, inflection occurs on the outside of derivation. That is, we have other types of morphology like compounding or derivation, usually called word formation, that occur before inflection in some sense. And derivational morphology has very different properties cross-linguistically. So it seems to be the type of morphological combination that it's still morphology, it's still involved in creating words or forms, it still involves internal structure, but it has very different characteristics. It's independent of the context of the sentence, let's say, the rest of the constituents in a sentence, processes such like agreement. And crucially, derivational properties such as, for example, from run to runner can change the meaning or category of a stem, change from, let's say, in this case, from verb to noun, from run to runner. And also this creation of a new lexical item altogether is also often accompanied by aspects of graded transparency. So it's a less predictable phenomenon, oftentimes less productive, and the newly created word oftentimes has its own semantics, its own idiosyncratic properties. And so it's very firmly a new lexical entry in the lexicon. One way of visualizing this, for example, in the formalization proposed by Mark Aronoff, is that we actually have two different types of morphological rules in our minds. One creates new lexical entries, that's derivation and compounding. We could call these morpholexical operations. So a whole lexical entry like run is turned into a whole new lexical entry like runner. And another type of linguistic object in our mind and another type of relationship or rule would be the one that creates grammatical forms like run, runs, running, and ran for this lexical entry given a given set of syntactic, morphosyntactic features. So it's in formal terms, we could say that we really have two different types of rules that have different kinds of inputs and outputs and different kinds of mental representations. Some linguistic theories do not recognize a difference between inflection and derivation. Others do. Amongst those that do, there is some sort of consensus. We also cannot characterize this very, very precisely, and it depends on our theory, but there is some sort of consensus that word formation such as derivation and compounding appears to be more of a certain lexical nature to do with creating entries, whereas inflection has what Bush calls a syntactic flavor. That is, it has to do with expressing morphosyntax via particular forms. And so we used this contrast to see whether L2 speakers would differ in their processing of inflected forms and derived forms, hoping that we would find some sort of contrast between the two that could serve as a kind of a result or a proxy for this more general distinction between lexicon and syntax in the minds of L2 speakers. The experimental paradigm that we have used to test morphological processing has been this priming paradigms. And so what we do in priming paradigms is we present a prime word and then we assess the influence of this prime word in a target word to which a response is made. So whenever we talk about priming, we're always talking about a difference between the response times or the accuracy, so some sort of measure in two different conditions, usually a related condition and an unrelated condition. So for example, we would compare the influence of a word like runner on a target like run as compared for the very same target to a control word like teacher and its influence on run. So whatever effect we find from runner to run in comparison to teacher to run is going to tell us something about the relationship between prime and target, between runner and run in speakers' minds. Here's another example. This one is not morphological in nature. It's a kind of orthographic priming. So you can see that here we have two words that have no morphological or semantic relationship, but they share words simply by accident. Scandal has nothing to do with scan. So we use these kinds of control conditions to try and assess whether our effects are truly morphological in nature. Of course, one of the problems of studying morphology is precisely that whenever we change morphology, of course, we also have a lot of whenever we have a morphological relationship, of course, we also have a lot of aspects of semantics and orthography and phonology that are shared between prime and target. And so it's important to use the tasks and the materials and the control conditions that will allow us to conclude that our effects are really morphological in nature. And we have different ways of doing this, but this is essentially the setup that we use to try and see whether people process runner in terms of its internal constituents, so in terms of some sort of morphological processing. In particular, within the set of priming paradigms that exist, we have used often this paradigm of masked priming, in which prime words are very, very briefly presented. I can show you an example here. I don't know if this will open. I hope so. This is an example. There you go. I'll just click here and display one. I don't know if you can see it on this side, on that side, I hope so. But essentially what you see here is the target word window when it's preceded by a certain prime. And the prime is presented very, very briefly, in this case only for 40 milliseconds. More or less, this is via a browser, so we don't have a precise control of the timings that you're seeing here. But essentially, this prime word is invisible, at least for the vast majority of speakers. These prime words are invisible, but they still exert an effect on the processing of the target. I can also show you here a slower prime duration, in this case with 100 millisecond prime. Maybe for some of you, this will be now easier to see, I hope. Can anyone see what the prime word is there? The one that appears just before window?
Wonder?
Yeah, that's it. Here it's the word wonder. At 40 milliseconds, very few people are able to read the prime word. When we get to something like 100 milliseconds, then a lot more people are able to see at least flashes, letters, but many people are able to read full words. And so we use this technique essentially to really reduce all sorts of strategies and conscious appreciation of the prime, but also, and this is important, when we use the very fast presentations of 50 milliseconds, what we can also do is we get a paradigm that is particularly sensitive to morphological processing. And how we know this is that when we use mask priming with very brief prime durations, we have robust effects, strong effects of morphological relatedness. So jumped primes jump, walked primes walk, but also for derivation, runner primes run. But we have very small or absent effects of semantic and orthographic relatedness. So at least with native speakers, I'll tell you a more complicated story in a bit. And so we use this essentially to remove the effects of semantic overlap between prime and target. We are able to attenuate those. And what remains, we think it's something to do with morphological decomposition. So with the ability that we have in reading, and this, it's important to say, takes place within the reading domain, but in reading, the ability that we have to essentially partition a form into its stem and suffix in terms of the letters that constitute the stem and the suffix, and we are able to tease them apart and then access the lexicon via its constituents, let's say. One reason why we know that this task is particularly good for tapping into morphological decomposition is that we also find strong effects of pseudo-morphology, so fake morphology such as from corner to corn. Corner, of course, is not a complex word, but it contains, apparently at very early stages of processing, it appears to contain a stem like corn and a suffix like er, the same suffix that you find in teacher, runner, etc. And what seems to be crucial for this effect to appear is that a real suffix is used. So if this is done only on the basis of overlapping letters, so like I showed you before, scandal, scan, then no priming is obtained. But once we have a word that appears like it could be complex, even though it's not, like corner, that is enough to trigger a priming effect on the recognition of its fake stem, its pseudo stem. And that those kinds of effects suggest that essentially the mask priming paradigm can function at the early stages of reading. Again, remember that we're talking about really what we call morpho-orthographic processing here. So it's the application of morphology to the early processes of reading. But at least within that domain, it seems that mask priming functions as a kind of diagnostic for the application of morphological rules. So if there are such suffixes in the language, then people are very eager to apply them to a written form, and so to search for morphology wherever it exists and to decompose words, even when it's really not the case in the lexicon that these are complex words. And so we use this paradigm, and morphologists who work in psycholinguistics are basically in love with this paradigm because it seems to give us some very direct insights about morphology and not so much about the other levels of the language system. Whenever we apply this masked morphological priming paradigm to L2 speakers, basically there's a big mess out there in the literature. Some people find strong effects, other people don't, other people find inhibition, other people find weak effects, and it's not clear why there is such a confusion in terms of the empirical findings in this domain. Possible reasons are simply that we're dealing with a lot of variability. Variability from study to study, language to language, variability from participant to participant, from word to word. So we probably have many causes that are influencing whether an L2 speaker is able to use morphology in this way and to decompose words. And what we tried to do was to essentially tackle these different types of variability by making certain changes and focusing on certain aspects. We wanted to make sure that we constrained the item variation by always priming the same target words with different kinds of morphology. We've been trying to analyze and examine by subject, by participant variation, so individual differences, estimating variability across people, and trying to figure out which variables, such as age of acquisition, may impact morphological priming in L2. And then when it comes to the variation that exists from study to study, we've conducted different meta-analyses that essentially summarize the literature out there. We're kind of trying to sift through all this noise, trying to get a little bit more of a clearer picture. And so in that spirit, I'll present the results of a couple of different studies to you where we use this approach to essentially contrast native and non-native speakers in their processing of both inflectional and derivational morphology in this domain of reading using the masked priming task. In study 1, we compared a group of L1 German speakers with a group of also speakers of German, L2 German, with a Russian L1. And then in study 2, we conducted a meta-analysis of the studies that exist in this domain. In study 3, we looked at age of acquisition effects. And in study 4, we looked at variability in morphological priming. I'll show you study 1 relatively quickly. What we did here was we compared, as I said, a group of German L1 with Russian L1, German L2 speakers. In inflectional and derivational priming. What we chose as examples of inflectional and derivational priming were forms like participles. If you know German, I'm sure Christina does, German T participles, and we compared these with ung nominalizations. Essentially, it looks like this. So we have forms like geöffnet, which is a participle priming öffnen, which means to open, or we have a derived form such as the opening, abertura, so öffnung, priming öffnen, which is to open. And the reason we chose these is, well, first because we already had quite a bit of research done with participles and we had a good sense about how they behaved. But also this way we were able to contrast two very productive, very transparent phenomena and operations with also the same length in terms of number of letters. So we were able to keep a bunch of properties very closely matched, but then we could contrast inflection and derivation on the very same target. Also of linguistic interest, participles, of course, then they can create adjectives, and adjectives can themselves take further inflection, for example, case in German. And so one might say that this is not the best example of really pure inflection, because it may also have a word formation function. But in this case, we took our chances essentially, and we were hoping to find differences between these two types of morphology. And besides our morphological conditions, we also had appropriate semantic and orthographic control conditions to try and ascertain whether our effects were truly morphological. And this was a lexical decision task. I haven't mentioned this yet, but people essentially need to do a decision on whether this target is a word or not. So they just need to respond yes or no, and then we measure in milliseconds how long it takes them to respond that öffnen is a word. Usually mask priming is accompanied by lexical decision, and it's a very reliable technique in the sense that it gives us, generally speaking, reproducible results. What we found is relatively to a control prime that is completely unrelated to the target. What we found was for native German speakers, the response time was smaller for inflected words than for control, and for derived words than for control. And so there is a priming effect, what we call a priming effect. People were sped up and they were faster at recognizing targets when they were preceded either by inflected or derived forms. And what we find for L2 was a small and more inconsistent, more variable, more noisy effect for inflected forms, but then we found a difference between inflection and derivation. That is, in the recognition of the same targets, the derived word had a more pronounced effect, a greater effect on the recognition of the target compared to the inflected form. And so, in other words, there was a difference between inflection and derivation for the L2 group, with derivational priming being robust in L2, but no differences between derivation and inflection, or at least no significant differences for native speakers of German. And so this went in the direction of our hypothesis, the idea that there is something about inflection that, by virtue of being more having a syntactic flavor, like I showed you before, that its processing becomes essentially less efficient, and that L2 speakers are finding it hard to partition the word in its constituents when it comes to inflectional morphology. In our second study, we tried to resolve a little bit of these empirical discrepancies out there by conducting a meta-analysis of the literature. We started this already a couple of years ago, and unfortunately this isn't published yet. And so in some sense, it's even a little bit outdated. There's been a couple of papers in the last couple of years that would be relevant to include. And so I cannot claim that this is like the be-all and end-all average of what's out there in the literature. But essentially what the meta-analysis allows us to do is to average an effect across a group of studies. So here we want to determine the average priming effect, that is, response times to related and unrelated morphological primes. And what the meta-analysis, this statistical technique, can do is that each study is weighted by the sample size. Studies that have more people have greater quality, they have less error, and so they should contribute more to the average effect. And we search the literature for relevant papers. There's a bunch of criteria that one needs to decide on before before undertaking a meta-analysis. But after doing that search and applying our criteria, we ended up with 25 L2 priming effects of morphology in the mask priming paradigm, compared to their respective control L1 groups. So the same effects for the same materials, but in tasks conducted by L1 speakers of the different languages. And what we can also do in a meta-analysis is to examine which variables modulate the effect or moderate the effect. So which variables are changing the magnitude of the average effect. We were particularly interested in the first one, derivation versus inflection, even though we tested a bunch of other variables and none of them seemed to exert any effect. So what we can see in this forest plot is the studies on inflection here at the top, the studies on derivation at the bottom, and each of them has this little ball, which is the priming effect in milliseconds that was obtained in each of the studies, along with its confidence interval, so with some notion of error in the study. And then here we have the summary estimate for all the effects. We can see that for inflection, on average, this effect is very small, about 8 milliseconds, but studies that tested derivational priming, they show a summary effect of 39 milliseconds, and so a lot larger than the effect for inflectional primes. When we compare those against the L1 controls in each of these studies, we see that the summary for L1, you can see this here in this gray polygon, is very similar for L1 speakers. The estimates are very similar for derivation and for inflection. So we have 34 milliseconds versus 38. So again, the difference appears to be specific to the L2 group between these two types of morphology. I'll just skip this in the interest of time, but another point that could be important when thinking about L2 morphological priming is that it seems, and this is another difference that we find between L2 and L1 groups, it seems that L2 speakers also show more orthographic priming. So we use the mask priming paradigm precisely because it gives us this insight into morphology without orthographic effects and without semantic effects, it seems that L2 speakers are at some stage of development of their lexicon that that they show actually orthographic priming in some experiments. In the ones that we've conducted, this is a very small and inconsistent effect. But when we do a meta-analysis of the studies that are out there, we can see that in many of the studies, this effect is not significant. So these intervals cross the zero line. And so if you look at each individual study, many times you don't find this effect. But then when we aggregate all the effects, we can see about 15 millisecond priming effect for orthographic relations. And this makes things substantially more complicated, because now if we find an effect in the L2 for morphology, we cannot quite know for sure if this is coming from morphology, from morphological decomposition, or from simple overlap in letters. In reality, I think this is my assessment of the situation. I think there is kind of three empirical patterns out there in the literature. On one of them, indeed, derivational priming is larger than inflectional priming. This is what we've obtained in different experiments, and at least for some speakers, I think this captures one empirical pattern out there. Another possibility is that essentially all types of morphology prime, perhaps equally, but orthographic relations also prime. And so you could think that essentially when people show these kind of effect, they are being driven by overlapping letters and they're not necessarily doing any morphological processing. And still another possible empirical pattern that has been argued for is that perhaps this is true for very advanced speakers, very proficient, immersed speakers. Perhaps it is true that some speakers are able to essentially show a native-like pattern of processing, and that is that morphological decomposition then applies to all kinds of morphology beyond orthographic relatedness. Whenever we conduct one experiment, essentially we could get one of these three outcomes. It's not clear yet, at least not to me, what variables lead one to show one or the other empirical patterns. But there are some indications that at the earlier stages of learning, speakers are primarily driven by orthography, and that at later stages of learning, very advanced, perhaps one is doing true morphological processing in a native-like way. What we have found in several experiments is this pattern at the top, that is a difference between inflection and derivation in L2 processing. How can this be explained? Where is this coming from? Well, we've done a large-ish study of around 100 speakers to try and figure out if we could relate age of acquisition differences to morphological processing in an L2. And what we did in this study is we used the same materials from our previous study in German, but now we tested a large sample of L1 Turkish speakers who learned Turkish from birth, but then they acquired German at any age, from either simultaneous bilinguals that acquired Turkish and German from birth, to very late learners that acquired German in their 30s. We didn't have many speakers in their 30s, just one or two, but we had quite a few speakers that acquired German in their teens and in their early 20s. And so we could capture with this sample within a single demographic community, that of Turkish speakers in Berlin, we could capture for that same community of immersed speakers that use German on a daily basis, we could capture the influence of age of acquisition continuously. So we're not comparing L1 to L2 anymore. Now we're comparing bilingual participants. All of them are bilingual, but they differ crucially in their age of acquisition of their second language. And when we did this study, we used a statistical technique that allows us to essentially put two regression lines together. And what we obtained was significant point of discontinuity for inflectional priming. For those speakers that had acquired their L2 earlier in life, between birth and 5 years of age, then these speakers behaved essentially in the same way, and they showed pronounced inflectional priming effects. After that, for speakers that started to learn German at age 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, we found a decrease in the magnitude of inflectional priming. However, for derivational priming, we did not find any such discontinuity, and essentially what we have is more of a straight line. That is, derivational priming does not seem to be affected by age of acquisition. Inflectional priming is affected by age of acquisition, but for late learners, those that begin learning a second language after an AOA of 5. And so this already raises a lot of questions. It suggests that one main determinant for the inflection versus derivation difference that we've been obtaining has to do with age of acquisition, but it raises questions about individual differences and about how these things may be represented in the mind. I'll come back to this point. But even though we wrote this paper in terms of an optimal window for the acquisition of morphology, there are unanswered questions here that I would like to get back to in a little bit, okay? Just before I get to the end of the talk, let me just present a final set of results. I don't know if I have time, maybe I'm already... Can you tell me how much time I have left?
I think it's fine. Yeah, I think so. If you take another 5-10 minutes, it just means we might have slightly less time for questions, but
okay.
I'm excited to see the results.
Good. Then I can just present to you this last study that we've done recently. It's a study focused on variability, and we've been trying to approach this in different ways. We've been trying to figure out if we can estimate different priming effects for different subjects. So that's at the participant level. We want to see if some people are essentially more efficient morphological processors than others. And at the same time, we've been looking at within participant variability. So the variability in the responses as a whole, if people are consistent or inconsistent, if they're fuzzy or if they're very tight in their responses. And the way we've been trying to tackle these problems have to do, make use of essentially mixed effects models. So mixed effects regression models, a statistical technique that allows separating these different sources of variance. And we can measure the amount of individual differences, the amount of item differences from word to word, and then the amount of fuzziness, let's say, within each participant. And we designed a very similar study. I'll just skip this bit. I'll come back if we have time. But we designed a new study that was done with L2 English. Now our speakers were L1 speakers of German. They had learned English at an average age of acquisition of 9. They were all quite proficient, and so around a C1 level. And we tried to have a lot of items for any given speaker. So we tried to build an experiment that would give us good estimates at the individual level. And what we did here, and in some sense, in many senses, this is actually a better experiment than the German one, because you can see here that the design of our stimuli is actually very, very parallel. So we have surfer priming surf, surfed priming surf, and for example, valuer or some other control word priming surf. So there is a distinction at the surface solely in one letter, but in reality, we're capturing this distinction between inflection and derivation. Here a nominalization, and here we have the past tense of a regular verb. And we were able again to prime exactly the same target with these two types of morphology. So very controlled experiment. And we were really wondering if under these very tight conditions, we were able to find a difference between inflection and derivation. Like I said, we designed this experiment to tap into the notion of variability. And the way we analyzed this was with Bayesian distributional mixed effects regression, a very long description of these statistical models. But essentially what they allow us to do is we can estimate priming effects, inflectional and derivational priming effects, on the mean response time, so on average, what is the RT in each condition, the response time in each condition. But also these models allow us to estimate the variability of responses, so the standard deviation, you might say, of the different responses that participants give. And what we found when we applied these models to this set of data, let me just tell you how many speakers we had. It was here, but I didn't mention. We did this with 69 L2 speakers of English. And when we applied these models to this data set, we found morphological priming that was actually more or less equivalent for both inflected and derived primes. And so this experiment doesn't show the same effect on the mean RTs that I've shown you before of less inflectional priming. Perhaps these speakers are particularly advanced, particularly good at their English. They learned English early enough, but we didn't find any difference at the level of means. We also didn't have an orthographic condition, and so by itself, we don't know if these effects are arising from morphology or from the overlap in letters. However, this is a depiction of the response times. You can see here that people were faster for both derived and inflected primes compared to the unrelated primes or control primes, and more or less equally fast in both of these conditions. But when we examine the effects on the variability, and so the effects on the standard deviation of responses, we found a difference between the three conditions, and the statistics appears to confirm that. This is in a weird scale of log milliseconds, and so it's a little hard to interpret. But what we found here was that showing a derivational prime increased the standard deviation of responses, and then showing an inflectional prime further increased the variation of responses relatively to the control condition. And again, like I said, this is all statistically backed up. It's all significant, let's say. Here is a graphical depiction of these different variabilities. This is a small effect, and it's not something that is very clear. We're not talking about huge differences in variability, but you can see here what our statistical model predicts. You can see that for the unrelated condition, we have a higher distribution, and so we have more response times around the middle here. That for the derivational condition, this becomes a little bit flattened. So some of those response times around the mean are actually dispersing a bit more to the sides. And for the inflectional condition, it goes further down. And so again, some of those around the mean response times are kind of dispersing to the sides. It would seem that these two types of morphology actually behave differently with respect to the variability of responses. Inflectional priming in particular produced an increase in variability. The derivational one is not very clear. The statistics show that trend, but it's not very clear. But the inflectional priming effect is very clear. And there is also a difference between inflection and derivation. How can this be explained? Well, we think that this increase in variability is the reflection of essentially a less efficient process of decomposition of inflected forms in L2, but that this is, let's say, inconsistent from trial to trial. In some trials, the benefits of an inflected prime are actually stronger, and in other trials, this may not produce any benefit. It's kind of difficult to decompose the word and to extract a benefit from it. So we essentially end up with more heterogeneous response times because of this process that is not reliably applied of morphological decomposition. This is our story, at least. It's not a perfect story for different reasons, but it went in the predicted direction. So across a number of experiments, we've obtained oftentimes less priming for inflection compared to derivation, and also more variable responses. We think that this means that L2 speakers, when they process inflected forms, they rely less on these mechanisms of decomposition and access to morphosyntactic features as compared to L1 native speakers. It could be that inflectional rules, in terms of their representation and their acquisition, that inflectional rules, as opposed to derivational rules, so rules that map between morphosyntax and form, how morphosyntax is expressed, may be less available, less efficient, more difficult to acquire for late learners of a language. And our study on age of acquisition suggests that this may be due to age-related or maturational changes, and that it has something to do with essentially getting older. This is our story, at least, and the set of results that we have obtained point in this direction. But what is more interesting, I think, about this, and that I would like to discuss a little bit with you, is that indeed, if this difference between inflection and derivation appears, and it's true, and if this is replicable, then we can show within the same system of language, within morphology, and for an operation that superficially is very much the same, that is decomposition of words, we can show a remarkable selectivity of the differences between L1 and L2. So even though we're talking about morphology in general, it would seem that it's a particular type of morphology, morphosyntax to form, that is affected by possibly by age of acquisition, and that shows the greatest L1 versus L2 differences. And this suggests that there is some internal organization in morphology that respects this distinction between inflection and derivation. Here is a study by Mirjana Bozic done with native speakers. So these sorts of studies haven't been done in the same way with L2 speakers, maybe in the future. But what Mirjana Bozic found, and this Marsland-Wilson group found in a series of fMRI studies, was that inflectional morphology, but not derivational morphology, appears to selectively engage the left inferior frontal gyrus. So Broca's area appears to be triggered, let's say, by this morphosyntactic content of inflection. When they did the same experiments with derivation, they actually find something a lot more distributed in the brain, bilateral in both hemispheres and a lot more distributed, suggesting that derivational relations are really more at the lexical level, as if we're talking about different words and not really about this process of grammatical decomposition. Another aspect that I would like to conclude this talk with is that this story, the way I've told it really cannot work completely and very well. And one of the reasons it cannot work very well is that when we write up these results, we tend to talk about L2 speakers in general. We tend to say L2 speakers do not decompose inflected forms. But this is really overreaching in reality, and it doesn't seem to be the case that no L2 speakers are decomposing inflected forms. So these differences don't seem to be categorical. They appear to be a lot more gradient in nature rather than all or one. So one example, let me go back, is precisely that age of acquisition effect. What we obtained was a decrease in the amount of inflectional priming as age progresses. So if people learned at age 13, let's say, they actually show a bit of inhibition. If they learned at age 9, they show a zero effect. If they learned at age 6, they show a priming effect. And so we really have a gradient pattern here, and we cannot really say native and non-native, and that's a true ontological category that separates these two groups. Probably not. We're dealing with something a lot more gradient, and so we need to contemplate different levels of native likeness. When we reanalyzed that first experiment that I've shown you, the one on German, the very first experiment that we did comparing L1 and L2 groups, we reanalyzed this experiment using these fancier statistical models, and we were able to get a good estimate for each person's priming effect. And what we found was, you can see that here on the panel on the left, what we found was a good deal of variation between different speakers in terms of the amount of their priming effect. So some speakers were showing quite robust priming effects that were in reality native-like. Other speakers were showing effects close to zero, and others were actually showing something akin to inhibition or conflict between the two. And again, we have a sort of a gradient pattern here. We cannot say that we've identified two groups of speakers. In reality, we have this progressive gradient effect. And so if we want to really explain these results, we'll need to account for this by postulating that there are different degrees of native likeness or non-native likeness. And even more, we may need to say that there are different degrees of morphological structure. So we cannot just simply say that a word like walked primes walk because it was decomposed into its 2 bits, or a word like runner primes run because it's either decomposed or not. This language doesn't really capture the results. In reality, we may have degrees of decomposition, and this is quite hard to formalize in a framework that may only recognize either there is morphological structure for a certain word or not. So these are the kinds of questions that we're struggling with at the moment. I've started all this research really from this viewpoint of differences between lexicon and grammar, differences between L1 and L2. I did my PhD with Harold Klassen, and I inherited much of this dual mechanism theory into my research, but it's true that many of these effects appear to be a lot more gradual in their effects, and so it's not very clear that the current models that we have, either of bilingualism or of morphology, are truly able to capture these small differences that we get from speaker to speaker, from observation to observation, and from word to word. So the next stage of my research is going to focus precisely on these different kinds of variability, and then on the explanation for those that we still hope to find, and then eventually on the development of formal models and computational models that could explain these effects. And with that, I open the room for questions.